The sky turned black as midnight at noon when the storm came rolling across the Colorado plains, swallowing Margaret Jenkins' hopes along with the horizon. She'd never seen clouds that angry before massive thunderheads, piled like mountains in the heavens, electric blue veins splitting the darkness as she urged her exhausted mare forward through the pelting rain. It was May of 1872, and Margaret was quickly realizing this journey across Arapahoe County might be her last mistake. Her mare stumbled, nearly sending Margaret face first into the mud. The normally sure-footed animal trembled beneath her, head bowed against the stinging rain. "Just a little farther, Belle," Margaret pleaded, her voice lost to the howling wind. She could barely see 10 feet ahead through the downpour, but she knew Coloma had to be somewhere beyond the next rise. She'd calculated 5 miles when she left the stage-coach station that morning, but the storm had disoriented her completely. The first hailstone struck her shoulder like a bullet, making her gasp. Then another hit Belle's flank, causing the mare to rear in panic. Margaret fought to keep her seat, fingers tangled in the horse's mane, but a flash of lightning and crack of thunder directly overhead proved too much. Belle bolted sideways, throwing Margaret clear before disappearing into the curtain of rain. Margaret landed hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. She struggled to her feet, calling frantically for her horse, but Belle was gone along with her supplies, her money, and any hope of reaching town before nightfall. For 20 minutes, she stumbled forward, soaked to the skin, her blue traveling dress plastered to her body and her boots filling with water. The temperature was dropping rapidly. When her foot caught on a hidden rock, sending her sprawling into a muddy gully, Margaret finally surrendered to tears. 22 years old, and this was how she would die alone in a storm, miles from anywhere. She huddled against the meager shelter of a scrub oak, shivering violently. Her thoughts drifted to her sister in Denver who would never know what happened, to the teaching position waiting for her in Coloma that she would never fill. The world grew hazy around the edges as cold seeped into her bones. The sound of hoofbeats registered dimly through the storm's fury. Hallucinations, she thought, as hypothermia took hold. But then a massive shape materialized through the rain, a horse, and atop it, a rider. "Hello," she called weakly, struggling to stand. The horse approached cautiously, its rider leaning forward to peer at her through the downpour. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, his face shadowed beneath a dripping hat brim. "Madam." His voice was deep, carrying easily through the storm. "What in God's name are you doing out here, my horse?" Margaret managed, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form words. "The stage-coach station. Trying to reach Coloma." The man dismounted in one fluid motion, crossing to her side and looking her over with sharp blue eyes. His face was weathered by sun and wind, a short beard covering his jaw. Not much older than 30, she guessed. "You're half frozen," he said, shrugging out of his oilskin coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. The sudden warmth made her gasp. "Coloma's still 7 miles north. You'd never make it in this." "I have to," she protested weakly. "I'm expected. You're coming home with me," he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "My ranch is just over that ridge. We can sort everything else out once you're warm and dry." Before she could protest, he'd lifted her onto his horse and swung up behind her. His arms came around her as he took the reins, his chest warm against her back. "I'm Will Steele," he said near her ear as the horse began moving. "Margaret Jenkins," she managed through chattering teeth, leaning instinctively into his warmth. "Hold on, Miss Jenkins. It won't be long now." True to his word, within 15 minutes a 2-story log house materialized through the rain, smoke curling from its stone chimney. A large barn stood nearby, and Margaret caught glimpses of other outbuildings through the storm. Will dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. Her legs buckled immediately, and he caught her against his chest. "Sorry," she murmured, mortified by her weakness. "Nothing to apologize for," he replied, and without hesitation scooped her into his arms. He carried her up onto the porch and somehow managed to open the door without putting her down. The warmth inside hit Margaret like a physical force. Will set her carefully on her feet in a large, rustic main room dominated by a stone fireplace where flames crackled merrily. "Sarah." Will called out. "We've got company." An older woman emerged from what appeared to be a kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she assessed Margaret with kind eyes that widened in alarm. Lord above. The poor thing's half drowned. "Will Steele, what were you thinking, bringing her and standing like that?" The woman rushed forward, taking Margaret's arm. "Come along, dear. Let's get you out of these wet things before pneumonia sets in." "This is Sarah Collier," Will explained. "She's our housekeeper and the closest thing to a doctor within 20 miles. "Pleased to meet you," Margaret managed weakly. "Save your strength, child," Sarah said, leading her toward a staircase. "Will, stoke that fire and put some water on for tea. Strong tea, mind you, with plenty of honey." Margaret found herself guided upstairs to a bedroom where Sarah efficiently helped her out of her sodden garments. The older woman clicked her tongue at Margaret's blue-tinged lips and shaking limbs. "Into bed with you. I'll find something dry for you to wear, but warmth comes first." Too exhausted to feel properly embarrassed, Margaret slipped between the sheets of the large four-poster bed. Sarah tucked the blankets around her with practiced hands, then disappeared, returning moments later with a flannel nightgown and several hot bricks wrapped in cloth. "These go at your feet," Sarah instructed, placing the warm bricks at the foot of the bed. "Now let's get this nightgown on you. It's one of mine, so it'll be a bit large, but it's clean and dry." With Sarah's help, Margaret managed to don the nightgown and sink back against the pillows. The warm bricks slowly began to chase away the bone-deep chill. "Mr. Steele, his ranch?" Margaret asked, fighting to keep her eyes open. "The Running S," Sarah confirmed. "One of the better cattle operations in Arapahoe County. Will built it from nothing after the war." She pressed a hand to Margaret's forehead. "You're still too cold. I'll bring up that tea and some broth if you can manage it." When Sarah returned with a tray, Will was with her. He changed into dry clothes, a simple flannel shirt and denims, and his dark hair was still damp, curling slightly at his collar. "How are you feeling, Miss Jenkins?" he asked, keeping a respectful distance from the bed. "Better, thank you," she replied, accepting the steaming cup Sarah offered. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." "No need for that," Will said with a slight wave of his hand. "No decent person would leave another out in that storm. Still, I'm grateful. Once the weather clears, I'll need to find my horse and get to Coloma. I'm the new school teacher," she explained. "I was supposed to arrive today to prepare for classes starting next week." Will and Sarah exchanged a glance. "That storm's not letting up anytime soon," Will said. "The creek between here and town will be flooded by now." "Even if we found your horse, you wouldn't be getting to Coloma for at least 3 days. Margaret's heart sank. 3 days. "But the school board, they'll understand," Sarah assured her. "Acts of God and all that. Besides, Jeremiah Wilson is on that board and his place is just down the valley. Will can ride over once the rain eases and let him know you're safe." "I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition," Will interrupted firmly. "You'll stay until the roads are passable. Sarah will see to whatever you need." There was something in his direct gaze that made argument seem futile. Margaret nodded, suddenly too tired to protest further. "Thank you," she murmured. "Rest now," Sarah said, taking the empty cup from Margaret's hands. Things will look brighter in the morning." As they left the room, Margaret sank deeper into the pillows, listening to the rain hammer against the roof and windows. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of Will Steele's strong arms around her as they rode through the storm, and the curious sense of safety she'd felt despite the danger. The morning brought pale sunlight filtering through lace curtains and the distant sound of activity. Margaret opened her eyes slowly, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar room with its simple furnishings and braided rug. Memory returned in a rush: the storm, her near-disastrous situation, and the taciturn rancher who had saved her. A soft knock at the door preceded Sarah's entrance. The housekeeper carried a tray with a steaming bowl and a cup of coffee. "Good morning, dear. Thought you might be hungry after your ordeal." Margaret sat up, suddenly conscious of her borrowed nightgown and tangled hair. "What time is it?" "Just past 8, Sarah replied, setting the tray across Margaret's lap. "You slept nearly 15 hours straight. Best medicine there is." The aroma from the bowl made Margaret's stomach growl embarrassingly loud. "This smells wonderful." "Just porridge with some dried apples and honey," Sarah said with a pleased smile. "Eat up while I find you something to wear. Your dress is still drying, I'm afraid." While Margaret ate, Sarah rummaged through a chest, eventually producing a simple blue cotton dress. This might do. It belonged to Will's sister before she married and moved to California. "You're about her size." "Mr. Steele has a sister?" Margaret asked between spoonfuls of the hearty porridge. "Emma. 4 years younger than Will. She married a banker from Sacramento and moved west 2 years ago." Sarah laid the dress across the foot of the bed. "Will's been running this place on his own since their father died in '67, right after they settled here. It seems like a substantial operation for one man. Oh, he's got hands, 6 of them year-round, more during spring roundup and branding. Good men, loyal to him." Sarah bustled around the room, straightening already neat items. "He fought for the Union, you know, came back different like most of them did, quieter, but a good man through and through." Margaret finished her breakfast, mulling over this information. "Has the creek flooded as he predicted?" Sarah's expression confirmed it before she spoke. "I'm afraid so. Tom He's the foreman rode out at dawn to check. The bridge to town is underwater and the roads washed out in 3 places." She patted Margaret's hand reassuringly. "Will's gone to the Wilson place to let them know about you. Should be back by midday." After breakfast, Margaret dressed in the borrowed clothes which fit remarkably well and made her way downstairs. The main floor of the ranch house was larger than it had appeared the previous night, a spacious great room with the stone fireplace, a dining area, and doors leading to what appeared to be a study and the kitchen. Everything was simple but solidly built, with touches like handmade quilts and polished wooden surfaces that spoke of care and pride. Sarah was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with practiced movements. She looked up with a smile when Margaret appeared. "There you are. Feeling more the thing this morning?" "Much better, thank you," Margaret replied. "Is there anything I can help with? I'd feel better keeping busy." "Always work to be done in a ranch house," Sarah said approvingly. "You can help me with these loaves if you're not afraid of a little flour on those hands." For the next hour, Margaret worked alongside the older woman, listening to stories about the ranch and the surrounding area. She learned that the Running S comprised nearly 2,000 acres, with a herd of several hundred cattle. Will had arrived in Colorado Territory after the war with his father and sister, determined to build something of their own. "The Steeles came from Kentucky originally," Sarah explained as they slid the bread into the oven. "Lost everything in the war. Mr. Steele, the elder one, brought his children west for a fresh start. He'd been a successful horse breeder before the war, had an eye for good stock." "And you?" "How did you come to be here?" Margaret asked, washing flour from her hands. A shadow crossed Sarah's face. "My husband and I had a homestead about 20 miles from here. Influenza took him in '68. Will offered me a place here after that. Couldn't manage the homestead alone at my age." The sound of hoofbeats outside interrupted their conversation. Sarah moved to the window. "That'll be Will now," she confirmed. "And it looks like he's found your horse." Margaret hurried to the front door. Sure enough, Will was dismounting from his horse, leading Belle by the reins. The mare looked tired but unharmed. "Belle!" Margaret rushed down the porch steps, forgetting decorum in her relief. The horse nickered softly in recognition as Margaret stroked her velvety nose. "Where did you find her?" "About 2 miles east," Will replied, his expression softening slightly at Margaret's evident joy. "She'd found shelter in a stand of cottonwoods. Your bags are still attached, though they're soaked through." "Thank you for looking for her," Margaret said earnestly. "I thought I'd lost everything." Will shrugged off her thanks. "Least I could do." He handed Belle's reins to a young ranch hand who had appeared from the direction of the barn. "Jake, give her a good rub-down and some extra oats." "Yes, sir," the boy replied, leading the mare away. Will turned back to Margaret. "I spoke with Jeremiah Wilson. He'll let the school board know you're safe but delayed. Said to tell you they're glad you made it this far and to take your time getting into town. The schoolhouse isn't going anywhere." Relief washed through Margaret. "That's very kind of them." "And of you to go to such trouble." "No trouble." Will's eyes lingered on her for a moment. "That dress, it was Emma's." "Yes, Sarah found it for me. I hope that's all right," he nodded. "Suits you." Then, seemingly embarrassed by his comment, he gestured toward the house. "Sarah feeding you properly?" "She's been wonderful," Margaret assured him. "We've just put bread in the oven." A hint of a smile touched Will's lips. "Best bread west of the Mississippi." He glanced at the sky, where dark clouds still loomed despite the temporary break in the rain. "More weather coming. I need to make sure the cattle in the north pasture are moved to higher ground." He started to turn away, then paused. "Dinner's at 6. Nothing fancy, but you're welcome to join us." "I'd like that," Margaret replied. "And perhaps tomorrow, if the weather improves, I could help around the house. I don't want to be a burden." Will studied her for a moment, his blue eyes thoughtful. "You're not a burden, Miss Jenkins, but if you're set on helping, I'm sure Sarah would appreciate it." With a nod, he strode toward the barn, his long legs covering ground quickly. Margaret watched him go, puzzling over the quiet rancher who seemed more comfortable with his cattle than with conversation. There was something compelling about him, a steadiness, a sense of purpose in everything he did. The skies opened up again an hour later, rain hammering against the windows as the wind picked up once more. Margaret helped Sarah around the kitchen, then spent the afternoon sorting through her sodden belongings. Most of her clothes would need thorough washing and drying, but her books, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, had survived with minimal damage. She was particularly relieved to find her mother's Bible unharmed, the pressed flower between its pages still intact. At 6 o'clock, Margaret made her way to the dining room where Sarah was setting a large platter of roast beef on the table. Will entered from outside, his hair damp from the rain but freshly changed into a clean shirt. "Miss Jenkins," he greeted her with a slight nod. "Mr. Steele," she returned. "I hope your cattle are safely settled, for now." He pulled out a chair for her. "Creek still rising. Might be longer than 3 days before the road to town clears." Margaret sat, trying to hide her concern. "I hope it won't cause too much damage." "Happens every few years," Sarah commented, bringing in a bowl of potatoes. "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, we manage." Dinner was a simple but hearty affair. Will ate with the focused efficiency of a man accustomed to seeing food as fuel rather than pleasure, though he complimented Sarah on the bread. Conversation was minimal until Sarah began asking Margaret about her background and teaching experience. "I completed my education at a ladies' seminary in St. Louis," Margaret explained. "I taught there for a year before accepting the position in Coloma. My sister lives in Denver with her husband, which is partly why I chose Colorado." "What subjects will you be teaching?" Sarah asked. "Everything, I expect. It's a small school, about 30 children of all ages, from what the board told me." Will, who had been quiet, looked up from his plate. "Ambitious, teaching all those ages at once." "I enjoy the challenge," Margaret replied. "Each child learns differently. Finding the right approach is like solving a puzzle." "What made you choose teaching?" he asked, surprising her with his evident interest. Margaret considered her answer carefully. "My father was a professor before he died. He believed education was the greatest gift one person could give another. I suppose I wanted to honor that belief." Will nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "Noble profession. Not easy out here, though. Seasons interfere with attendance. Some families need their children working more than learning." "All the more reason to make the learning count when they are there," Margaret countered. A ghost of a smile touched Will's lips. "Fair point, Miss Jenkins." After dinner, they moved to the great room where Sarah produced some mending while Will attended to a ledger of some sort. Margaret found herself drawn to the bookshelves flanking the fireplace, surprised by the variety of volumes. "See anything of interest?" Will asked, noticing her perusal. "Several things," she admitted. "I wouldn't have expected Thoreau and Emerson alongside practical guides to cattle breeding." "My father's collection, mostly," Will explained. "He believed a man should feed his mind as well as his body." "A wise philosophy," Margaret said, selecting a volume of Emerson's essays. "May I? Help yourself." He watched her for a moment longer than necessary before returning to his ledger. The evening passed pleasantly, with only the sound of the fire crackling, the scratch of Will's pen, and the occasional comment from Sarah breaking the comfortable silence. Margaret found herself stealing glances at Will, observing the furrow of concentration between his brows, the strength in his hands as he wrote, the way firelight caught in his dark hair. When Sarah announced she was retiring for the night, Margaret realized how late it had grown. She closed her book reluctantly. "I should turn in as well," she said, rising from her chair. "Thank you for a lovely evening." Will stood, setting aside his work. "I'll see to the fire." Margaret paused at the foot of the stairs, looking back at him. "Good night, Mr. Steele." He met her eyes across the room. "Good night, Miss Jenkins. Sleep well." Something in his steady gaze sent a curious warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. Margaret climbed the stairs with a strange fluttering in her chest, wondering at her reaction to a man she'd known barely a day. The next morning brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the rain fell harder, drumming against the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. After breakfast, Will donned his oilskin coat to check on the livestock. "Don't wait on lunch for me," he told Sarah. "Likely be out till mid-afternoon." "Be careful near that creek," she admonished. "Took Matthews from the Peterson place last spring when he tried crossing during the flood." Will nodded grimly. "Won't take any foolish chances." After he left, Margaret helped Sarah with household tasks, churning butter, mending linens, and preparing vegetables for a stew. Around midday, 3 of the ranch hands came in for their meal, removing sodden hats respectfully when introduced to Margaret. They were a diverse group. Tom Jenkins, no relation, they established with a laugh. The weather-beaten foreman in his 50s, Luis Mendoza, a skilled horseman from New Mexico Territory, and young Jake Harris, barely 18 and clearly in awe of Will. "Miss Jenkins was caught in the storm," Sarah explained as they ate. Mr. Steele found her and brought her here until the road to town clears. Lucky he found you, madam, Tom said seriously. That storm came up fiercer than any I've seen in years. Have you worked for Mr. Steele long? Margaret asked. Since he and his pa first established the place, Tom confirmed. Going on 7 years now, best outfit I've worked for in 30 years of ranching. Lewis nodded in agreement. Senor Steele is a fair man, pays well, treats his people with respect. His dark eyes twinkled. Even if he is sometimes too serious. Jake swallowed a large mouthful of stew. Mr. Steele knows more about cattle than anybody. He's teaching me about breeding stock and keeping the books. Jake here is being groomed for bigger things, Tom explained with obvious pride. Boy's got a head for numbers and a good eye for horseflesh. The men finished their meal quickly, thanking Sarah before heading back out into the deluge. Margaret helped clean up, thinking about what she'd learned of Will Steele, a fair employer, respected by his men, invested in teaching a young ranch hand skills beyond manual labor. It added layers to her understanding of the quiet rancher. The afternoon stretched long with no sign of Will's return. By 4 o'clock, Sarah was clearly worried, checking the window every few minutes. He should have been back by now, she fretted. Even allowing for the weather. Margaret tried to reassure her. He seemed very capable. I'm sure he's just being thorough. That's what I'm afraid of, Sarah replied. Too thorough for his own good sometimes. That creek can rise 6 feet in an hour during weather like this. By 5 o'clock, with darkness beginning to fall early under the heavy clouds, Sarah's worry had infected Margaret. She found herself straining to hear hoofbeats over the pounding rain. When the door finally burst open at 5:30, both women rushed to the entryway. Will stood dripping on the threshold, his face pale beneath streaks of mud, supporting a half-conscious Lewis. Sarah, hot water and bandages, he ordered, helping the injured man to a chair. He took a bad fall when his horse spooked crossing the east pasture, think his arms broken. Sarah hurried to comply while Margaret moved forward instinctively. How can I help? Hold him steady while I get these wet things off him, Will directed, already working on Lewis's coat. Together they managed to remove the soaked outer garments. Lewis's left arm was clearly broken, the unnatural angle making Margaret's stomach turn, though she forced herself to remain calm. More concerning was his ashen color and the violent shivering that racked his body. Sarah returned with hot water, bandages, and several blankets. I've sent Jake for Dr. Miller, but in this weather. We'll have to do what we can, Will finished grimly. He looked at Margaret. You ever set a bone before? She swallowed hard. No, but I've assisted once when my sister broke her wrist. I know the principle, Will nodded. That'll have to do. He turned to Lewis, speaking clearly. Lewis, we need to set that arm before the doctor can get here. It's going to hurt like hell, but it needs doing. The injured man nodded weakly. Patron, do what you must. Will explain the process to Margaret in low tones. She would need to hold Lewis's shoulder while Will pulled and aligned the broken bone. Sarah would have splints ready. On 3, Will said, positioning his hands. 1, 2, 3. Lewis's scream tore through the house as Will pulled with practiced precision. Margaret held firm despite her instinct to recoil, feeling the sickening shift as the bone realigned. Lewis slumped in the chair, consciousness finally fleeing. Good, Will murmured, checking the alignment carefully before nodding to Sarah, who began splinting the arm with wooden slats and tight bandages. He's better out for this part anyway. When they finished, Will lifted Lewis easily and carried him to a small bedroom off the kitchen. Once the injured man was settled, wrapped in warm blankets with a fire built up in the small hearth, Will finally allowed himself to sink into a chair, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. You're half frozen yourself, Sarah scolded, pressing a cup of hot coffee into his hands. "Get out of those wet clothes before you end up with pneumonia." Will didn't argue, disappearing upstairs while Sarah prepared a simple dinner. When he returned in dry clothing, Margaret was struck by the shadows beneath his eyes and the tight lines around his mouth. "Is Louis going to be all right?" she asked as he took a seat at the table. "If infection doesn't set in," Will replied grimly. "Compound fracture bone broke through the skin. Always dangerous." "You did well," Sarah assured him, placing a plate before him. "Set it clean as any doctor could." Will didn't respond to the praise, instead asking, "How did you know what to do, Miss Jenkins? You said you'd assisted before." Margaret nodded. "My sister fell from a horse when she was 16. The doctor let me help while he set her wrist." She smiled faintly. "I nearly fainted, but he said I'd done well." "You did," Will confirmed. "Steady hands, important quality." They ate in silence after that, all three too tired for conversation. When the meal was finished, Will insisted on taking the first watch with Louis, promising to wake Sarah in a few hours. Margaret helped clean up, then hesitated before heading upstairs. "Mr. Steele seems exhausted. Perhaps I could sit with Louis for a while, let him rest." Sarah studied her thoughtfully. "That's kind of you. He won't ask for help, but I think he needs it tonight." "Been up since before dawn, then carrying Louis for nearly 2 miles when the horse bolted." She shook her head. "I'll show you what to watch for." Armed with Sarah's instructions, Margaret entered the small bedroom where Louis lay. Will sat in a straight-backed chair beside the bed, his posture rigid despite his evident fatigue. "Sarah said you might appreciate some relief," Margaret said quietly. "I'm happy to sit with him for a while." Will looked up, surprise crossing his features. "That's not necessary." "You're a guest here." "A guest who would like to help," she countered gently. "You need rest as much as he does." For a moment she thought he would refuse, then his shoulders slumped slightly. "Just for an hour, then. Wake me if his fever rises or if he seems in greater pain." "I will," she promised. Will stood, relinquishing the chair. As she took his place, their hands brushed briefly his calloused and warm despite the day's chill. A current seemed to pass between them, making Margaret's breath catch. "Thank you," Will said, his voice low. "You're welcome," she replied softly. After he left, Margaret settled in to watch over the sleeping ranch hand. Louis's breathing was steady, his color somewhat improved. She checked his forehead periodically for fever and adjusted the blankets when he shifted restlessly. The hour passed, but Will didn't return. Margaret continued her vigil, suspecting that Sarah had intercepted him, and insisted he get proper rest. The night deepened around the ranch house, rain still drumming against the roof, though with less fury than before. Louis woke briefly around midnight, disoriented and in pain. Margaret offered him water and the laudanum Sarah had left, speaking soothingly until he drifted back to sleep. She was checking his splints when the door opened quietly. Will stood in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep. "Sarah said you were still here. I didn't mean for you to sit up all night." "I didn't mind," Margaret whispered, rising from her chair. He woke once, took some laudanum, and went back to sleep. Will moved to the bedside, checking Louis's condition with practiced eyes. "Fever's not too high." "That's good." He straightened, studying Margaret. "You should get some rest." "So should you," she countered. A faint smile touched his lips. "Touché, Miss Jenkins." They left the room together, Sarah appearing from her quarters to take the next watch. In the darkened hallway, Will hesitated. "Thank you for your help today. Not many women would have the stomach for what you did." "Not many men would carry an injured worker 2 miles through a storm," she replied, "or know how to set a broken bone." "Necessary skills out here," he said with a modest shrug. "Still, I'm grateful." They stood for a moment in the dim light from the banked fire, an unexpected intimacy in the quiet house. Margaret found herself noticing details: the small scar near his right eyebrow, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the clean scent of soap that clung to him. "Good night, Mr. Steele," she said finally, when the silence stretched too long. "Will," he corrected softly. "After today, I think you can call me Will." Something warm unfurled in her chest. "Then I'm Margaret." His smile deepened, transforming his serious face. "Good night, Margaret." She climbed the stairs with a curious lightness in her step, despite the day's exertions. Sleep came quickly, but her dreams were filled with strong hands and blue eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed composure. Morning brought a blessed break in the storm. Margaret woke to actual sunshine streaming through her window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light. She dressed quickly in another of Emma Steele's dresses that Sarah had altered slightly to fit her better, eager to see how Louis had fared through the night. She found Sarah in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with a relieved expression. "Doctor finally made it through about an hour ago," she reported. "Says Will did a fine job with the setting. Louis will keep the arm, though it'll be weeks before he can work properly again." "That's wonderful news," Margaret said sincerely. "Where is everyone?" "Doctor's still with Louis. Will's out checking the damage from the storm. The hands are all seeing to the cattle." Sarah handed Margaret a cup of coffee. "That young doctor was mighty impressed with how you helped yesterday. Said not many ladies would have the fortitude." Margaret felt a flush of pride at the second-hand praise. It was instinct more than bravery. "I couldn't just stand by when someone needed help." "That's a rare quality," came Will's voice from the doorway. He stood removing his hat, the morning sun highlighting auburn tones in his dark hair that Margaret hadn't noticed before. "Morning." "Good morning," she replied, suddenly conscious of her appearance. "Sarah says the doctor arrived." Will nodded, accepting a coffee cup from Sarah. "Miller's a good man. Says Louis should recover fully with time." He took a deep breath, seeming to come to a decision. "The creek's receded enough that the road to the Wilson place is passable. Thought you might like to ride over with me today, let them know you're well. Might help ease your mind about the teaching position." Margaret brightened at the prospect. "I'd like that very much. When would we leave?" "After breakfast, if that suits you. It's about an hour's ride." Sarah beamed at both of them. "I'll pack some of those honey cakes for Abigail Wilson. She's always had a sweet tooth." Breakfast was a livelier affair than previous meals, with Dr. Miller joining them and pronouncing Louis on the mend. The young doctor, barely 30 with spectacles and an earnest manner, was clearly impressed with the running-s operation. "Finest ranch in the county," he declared, helping himself to more eggs. "And not just for the stock. The way you look after your hands is commendable, Steele." Will accepted the compliment with a nod. "Can't run cattle without good men." "If only more operators felt that way," Miller said with feeling. "I spent 3 days last month patching up fellows from the double-bar outfit after Cameron worked them 18 hours straight in freezing weather." Margaret watched the exchange with interest, noting how Will deflected praise but listened intently when the doctor spoke about proper care for Louis during recovery. There was a depth to him that became more apparent with each interaction, a thoughtfulness behind his reticent exterior. After breakfast, Will had Belle saddled for Margaret while he rode his own mount, a powerful black gelding named Midnight. The air was fresh after the storm, filled with the scent of wet earth and sage. Wildflowers had already begun to emerge in vibrant patches across the landscape. "It's beautiful," Margaret commented as they rode side by side across a meadow dotted with purple lupine and golden columbine. "I didn't appreciate it properly during the storm." Will's expression softened as he surveyed the land. "Colorado shows her best face after rain. Everything comes alive." He pointed toward distant mountains, their peaks snow-capped against the blue sky. Those are the front range, best view in the territory when the light hits them just right at sunrise. His evident love for the land made Margaret smile. You sound like a man who's found his place in the world. Will considered this. Suppose I have. Took a while after the war. Nothing looked right for a time, like I was seeing everything through smoked glass. He glanced at her, then away. Land has a way of healing a man if he listens to it. The personal admission surprised her. Is that why you came west? To heal? Partly, he acknowledged. My father saw what the war did to me, thought new country might help. A faint smile touched his lips. He was right, though I was too stubborn to admit it then. And your sister, did she find healing here too? Emma adapted better than either of us. Always had a gift for making herself at home wherever she landed. His expression grew distant. She deserved California and all its comforts. This life was too hard on her, though she never complained. They rode in companionable silence for a while, cresting a hill that offered views across the rolling landscape. The Wilson Ranch came into sight, smaller than the Running S, but prosperous-looking, with a neat farmhouse and several outbuildings. Jeremiah Wilson and his wife Abigail welcomed them warmly, insisting they stay for lunch. Wilson was a robust man in his 60s with a shock of white hair and a booming laugh. His wife, some years younger, had a gentle manner that immediately put Margaret at ease. "So you're our new school teacher?" Abigail exclaimed, leading Margaret to the parlor while the men discussed the storm's impact. "We've been so looking forward to having a proper school again. The last teacher only stayed 6 months before deciding frontier life wasn't to her liking." "I'm made of sturdier stuff, I assure you," Margaret replied with a smile. "Although I must admit, being caught in that storm gave me pause." "Providence led Will to find you," Abigail said with conviction. "That man has always had a knack for being in the right place at the right time." They spoke at length about the school and community. Margaret learned that Coloma, though small, was a growing town with a general store, church, and even a hotel of sorts. The school building was new, constructed just last year with funds raised by the community. "We value education here," Jeremiah explained when he and Will joined the women. "My own schooling was limited, but I wanted better for my children and grandchildren." Over lunch, they discussed when Margaret might reasonably get to town. The bridge would need repairs, Jeremiah confirmed, but likely would be passable within a week. "No rush," he assured her. "School term doesn't officially start until the 15th. Gives families time to finish spring planting." "Margaret's been a godsend at the ranch," Will commented, surprising her with the praise. "Helped set Luis Mendoza's arm yesterday after a bad fall." The Wilsons looked suitably impressed. "A teacher and a healer," Jeremiah said approvingly. "Coloma's lucky to have you, Miss Jenkins." When they prepared to leave, Abigail pressed a small packet into Margaret's hands. "Seeds from my garden," she explained. "Sweet peas and morning glories. The teacher's cottage has a nice southern exposure that would suit them perfectly." Margaret thanked her, touched by the thoughtful gift. As they rode away, Will glanced at the packet curiously. "You garden?" "I've always wanted to," Margaret admitted. "Growing up in St. Louis, we only had a small yard. My mother managed a few roses, but not much else." Will nodded thoughtfully. "Good soil around your cottage in town." "Those should do well." After a moment he added, "Sarah's put in quite a garden at the ranch. She could show you some tricks before you go." "Before you go." The words hung between them, a reminder that Margaret's stay was temporary. She felt an unexpected pang at the thought of leaving the Running S. "I'd like that," she said simply. They took a different route home, Will leading her along a ridge that offered spectacular views across the valley. The creek that had been so dangerously swollen was visible in the distance, still running high but contained within its banks. Another day or two and it should be crossable, Will observed. Though the bridge may take longer to repair. Margaret nodded, not quite ready to contemplate leaving. The Wilsons are lovely people. I can see why you value their friendship. Known Jeremiah since we arrived in the territory. He helped my father choose this land, taught us about the weather patterns and soil conditions. Will's expression grew reflective. When my father died, Jeremiah stepped in, helped me sort through everything. Don't know what I'd have done without him. You were very young to take on such responsibility. 23, Will confirmed. Felt like a boy playing at being a man most days. Made plenty of mistakes that first year. Yet you built all this. Margaret gestured at the expansive ranch coming into view below them. That speaks to your character and determination. Will looked at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. You've got a generous way of seeing people, Margaret Jenkins. I try to see truly, she replied. It's important in teaching looking beyond first impressions to the potential beneath. His lips quirked in a half-smile. And what potential do you see in a weather-beaten rancher who talks more easily to cattle than people? The directness of his question surprised her. Margaret considered her answer carefully. I see a man of principle who built something meaningful from nothing, who cares for those dependent on him, human and animal alike, who goes out in storms to bring strangers to safety. She met his gaze steadily. That's worth seeing, I think. Something shifted in Will's expression, a softening around his eyes, a vulnerability quickly masked. He cleared his throat. We should get back before Sarah sends out a search party. The remainder of the ride passed in silence, but it was a comfortable one, filled with unspoken understanding rather than awkwardness. As they approached the ranch, Will pointed out features of the operation: the north pasture where the best grazing was found, the stream that never ran dry even in drought years, the stand of cottonwoods where he planned to build a larger barn come autumn. Margaret listened, increasingly aware that he was showing her not just his ranch, but his vision, the future he saw for this place he'd built with his hands and heart. It felt like a gift, this glimpse into his private thoughts, and she treasured it accordingly. Sarah greeted them with news that Lewis was awake and asking for Will. While he went to check on his injured hand, Margaret helped Sarah prepare dinner, relating the details of their visit to the Wilson ranch. Abigail Wilson's a fine woman, Sarah commented, rolling out dough for dumplings. Her garden's the envy of the county. Those seeds she gave you will grow beautifully. I've never had much success with plants, Margaret admitted, chopping carrots with neat precision, but I'd like to try. Sarah studied her thoughtfully. You've taken to ranch life more easily than I'd have expected for a city-raised teacher. Margaret considered this. There's a simplicity to it that I find appealing. In St. Louis, everything was about appearances and social standing. Here, the work matters, the people matter. She smiled. Even if I do miss indoor plumbing, Sarah laughed, a warm, genuine sound. Don't we all? Will's talking about putting in proper plumbing next year. He's always looking to improve things. He seems very forward-thinking. He is that, Sarah agreed. Not just with the ranch either. Been saving to build a proper library in Coloma. Says a town needs books as much as it needs a church. This revelation delighted Margaret. He didn't mention that when we were discussing the school. Sarah's eyes twinkled knowingly. Will doesn't talk much about his charitable works. Prefers people not to make a fuss. The evening meal was enlivened by Lewis joining them, his arm in a sling but his spirit undampened. He regaled them with an embellished account of his accident, making it sound like an epic battle against the elements rather than an unfortunate fall. And then Senor Will appears like a ghost through the rain, carrying me as if I weigh nothing, Lewis declared dramatically. I tell him, leave me, save yourself. But no, he is too stubborn. Will shook his head, though Margaret caught the hint of amusement in his eyes. You were delirious, Lewis. All you said was a string of Spanish curses that would make your mother blush. Lewis grinned unrepentantly. Perhaps, but I was very heroic in my delirium. The easy camaraderie around the table warmed Margaret's heart. This was a household where people genuinely cared for one another, regardless of position or background. It was something she'd rarely witnessed in St. Louis society. After dinner, Will invited Margaret to his study, a small room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a sturdy desk covered in papers. Thought you might like to see these, he said, selecting several volumes from a shelf. Books I've collected for the town library. Not sure if they'd be suitable for the school as well. Margaret accepted them eagerly, examining titles ranging from basic primers to more advanced texts on natural science and mathematics. These are wonderful, she said sincerely. Especially these science volumes, they have such clear illustrations. Will nodded, pleased by her reaction. Ordered them from Denver last fall. There's more coming with the next supply wagon. Sarah mentioned your plans for a library, Margaret said, watching his expression. It's a wonderful gift to the community. Will looked slightly embarrassed by her praise. Just seems right. Books opened the world for me as a boy. Every child deserves that chance. Margaret set the books aside, struck by a sudden certainty. You're an extraordinary man, Will Steele. His eyes met hers, surprise giving way to something deeper. For a breathless moment she thought he might step closer, might bridge the small distance between them. Instead, he cleared his throat. It's getting late. You must be tired after our ride today. Yes, she agreed, recognizing his retreat but not taking offense at it. Some feelings needed time to be acknowledged. Thank you for showing me the books, and for taking me to meet the Wilsons. My pleasure, he replied, and she could tell he meant it. That night, Margaret lay awake longer than usual, replaying moments from the day in her mind, Will's profile against the sky as they rode across the ridge. The passion in his voice when he spoke of his library plans. The way his eyes had lingered on her face in the study. She was developing feelings for him that went beyond gratitude or admiration, and the realization both thrilled and unsettled her. She'd come to Colorado for a fresh start, focused on her teaching career. Romance had been the furthest thing from her mind. Yet in just a few days, a taciturn rancher with kind eyes and steady hands had begun to occupy her thoughts in ways she hadn't anticipated. The next day dawned clear again, the landscape beginning to dry under the spring sun. Will left early to assess damage to the fences along the property's eastern boundary, but not before asking Margaret if she'd like to join him the following day to check on a newborn calf he was concerned about. It's about an hour's ride, he explained over breakfast. Might be interesting for you to see that part of the operation. I'd love to, she replied, perhaps too quickly judging by Sarah's knowing smile. With Will gone for the day, Margaret split her time between helping Sarah and sitting with Lewis, who proved to be an entertaining companion despite his injury. Born in New Mexico to a Spanish mother and Mexican father, he'd worked on ranches since boyhood and had a seemingly endless supply of stories about his adventures. How long have you worked for Will? Margaret asked as she helped change the bandage on his arm. 4 years now, Lewis replied. I was working for a bad outfit near Santa Fe. The patron there, he treated men like animals. One day, I had enough and left without my wages. He smiled at the memory. I was riding north when I met Senor while delivering cattle to Fort Union. He needed another hand for the drive back to Colorado. Been here ever since. He inspires loyalty, Margaret observed. Lewis nodded emphatically. Because he gives it in return. Last winter, my mother was sick in Taos. Senor will not only gave me time to go to her, he sent money for a doctor. His expression grew serious. Many bosses talk about respect. Will Steele lives it. Throughout the day, Margaret heard similar stories from the other hands while teaching young Jake to read when he discovered the boy had never attended school. While standing up to a cattle buyer who tried to cheat Tom on a deal. While ensuring that every man had warm quarters and good food even in the leanest times. He'll be embarrassed if he knows we're singing his praises, Sarah commented when she caught the tail end of one such conversation. Never did learn to accept a compliment properly. Why is that, do you think? Margaret asked. Sarah considered the question while kneading bread dough. The war changed him. He doesn't speak of it much, but I gather he saw terrible things, lost men under his command, came back carrying a weight. Her hands stilled. Some men let that weight embitter them. Will channeled it into building something good, but he's never quite believed he deserves happiness for himself. Margaret pondered this insight as she helped prepare dinner. It explained much about Will's reticence, his dedication to others while maintaining a certain personal distance. It made her heart ache for the young soldier who'd returned from war carrying invisible wounds. Will returned late, joining them for dinner with apologies for his tardiness. Creek took out more fencing than I expected. We'll be repairing it for days. Despite his evident fatigue, he listened attentively as Margaret described a teaching method she'd developed for helping children learn their letters, offering thoughtful questions that showed genuine interest. When she mentioned her concern about having enough books for all the students, he immediately offered duplicates from his personal collection. "I'll have them packaged up before you leave," he promised. The reminder of her eventual departure cast a momentary shadow over the conversation. Margaret pushed it aside, focusing instead on the present moment, the comfortable warmth of the kitchen, the satisfaction of good food after a day's work. The way Will's eyes crinkled when he smiled at something Lewis said. Later, they gathered in the great room as had become their custom. Will attended to correspondence while Margaret read and Sarah mended. It was domestic and peaceful in a way Margaret had rarely experienced, even in her family home where social obligations had often intruded on quiet evenings. When Sarah retired for the night, Will set aside his letters and moved to stoke the fire. The dancing flames highlighted the strong planes of his face as he straightened, catching Margaret watching him. "What are you reading?" he asked, nodding toward the book in her lap. "Thoreau," she admitted with a smile. "I found myself curious after seeing it on your shelf. And what do you think of him? I find his ideas compelling, if sometimes impractical." She closed the book, marking her place with a finger. "His vision of a simplified life has merit, but few people have the luxury of withdrawing from society as he did." Will considered this, leaning against the mantelpiece. True enough. Still, there's wisdom in examining which complications we bring upon ourselves unnecessarily. "Is that why you chose ranch life? To simplify?" A smile touched his lips. "Hardly simple running cattle, but there's a directness to it. The problems are real weather predators, disease not manufactured from pride or ambition." "I can see the appeal," Margaret admitted. "Teaching has that quality too. Children don't pretend to be what they're not. They simply are, with all their struggles and triumphs laid bare." Will studied her thoughtfully. "You'll make a fine teacher for Coloma." "I hope so," she replied. "It's a responsibility I don't take lightly." "That's why you'll succeed." He straightened from his position by the fire. "We should start early tomorrow if you still want to see the north pasture. That new calf needs checking." "I'm looking forward to it," Margaret said honestly. Will hesitated, seeming on the verge of saying something more. Instead, he simply nodded. "Good night, then." "Good night, Will." As he left the room, Margaret remained by the fire, Thoreau forgotten in her lap. She was falling for Will Steele steadily and irrevocably. The realization should have frightened her. They'd known each other less than a week, and she had commitments in Coloma, but instead, it filled her with a calm certainty. Some connections defied conventional timelines. The question was whether Will felt it too, and if so, what either of them would do about it. Morning brought perfect weather for their ride, clear skies with just enough spring crispness to make the air feel clean and invigorating. Will had bells saddled and waiting when Margaret emerged from the house, dressed in her own riding skirt that Sarah had managed to salvage and press. "You look ready for an adventure," Will commented, a warmth in his eyes that made her heart skip. "I am," she replied with a smile. "I've never seen a newborn calf before." They set out at an easy pace, Will pointing out features of the ranch as they rode. The land was beginning to green with spring growth, wildflowers dotting the meadows in bright splashes of color. Margaret found herself captivated not just by the scenery, but by Will's evident love for every acre they traversed. "My father used to say you don't really own land," he told her as they paused atop a rise overlooking a verdant valley. "You're just its caretaker for a time. Your job is to leave it better than you found it." "A wise philosophy," Margaret observed. "Do you think you've accomplished that?" Will surveyed the landscape thoughtfully. "Working on it. We've improved the grazing rotation, planted cottonwoods along the creek to prevent erosion." He glanced at her. "Takes time to see the full results, kind of work you do for the next generation more than yourself." "Like teaching," Margaret said. "The seeds you plant may not bloom until long after the children have left your classroom." His smile deepened. "Exactly like that." They continued on, crossing a shallow stream where Margaret spotted a family of otters playing among the rocks. Will seemed pleased by her delight in the small creatures, waiting patiently while she watched their antics. "Emma used to spend hours observing the wildlife," he commented. "Said she learned more about life watching animals than she ever did from books." "Your sister sounds like a kindred spirit," Margaret replied. "I've always believed there are lessons in nature if we pay attention." Will's expression softened with reminiscence. "You'd like her. She's forthright like you, sees beneath the surface of things." The comparison pleased Margaret more than it probably should have. They rode on, eventually reaching a sheltered valley where a small herd of cattle grazed. Will led her toward a cow and calf slightly separated from the others, approaching slowly to avoid startling them. "This is Daisy," he explained, dismounting and gesturing for Margaret to do the same. "One of our best mothers, but this birth was difficult. I've been worried about the calf." Margaret followed him cautiously, impressed by how the normally skittish cow seemed calm in Will's presence. The calf, a wobbly-legged creature with enormous eyes, regarded them with wary curiosity. "He's beautiful," Margaret breathed. Will corrected with a smile. "And yes, she is. Strong too, despite the rough start." He knelt, checking the calf carefully while the mother watched with bovine patience. "Looking much better today. Good weight, clear eyes." Margaret stayed a respectful distance away, but the calf, after inspection, tottered toward her on uncertain legs. Before she could retreat, the small animal butted gently against her skirt. "She likes you," Will said, amusement and something warmer in his voice. "Good judge of character." "Or she's mistaken me for a source of milk," Margaret laughed, cautiously extending a hand to stroke the calf's soft head. "Either way." Will straightened, watching them with evident pleasure. "I'll need to name her. Any suggestions?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "Hope," she suggested finally. Since she overcame a difficult beginning, Will nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Hope it is." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. Margaret felt it like a physical touch, warming her from within. They spent another hour checking other new calves and their mothers, while explaining aspects of cattle breeding and care that Margaret found unexpectedly fascinating. His knowledge was extensive, his observations keen, and his affection for the animals unmistakable. For lunch, they settled beside a clear stream beneath the shade of a large cottonwood. Sarah had packed a simple but hearty meal of cold chicken, bread, and apple tarts that they shared while watching the play of light on the water. "I can see why you love it here," Margaret said, leaning back against the tree trunk. "There's a peace to this place." Will nodded, stretching his long legs out before him. "Took me a while to appreciate it. After the war, I couldn't settle anywhere, too restless, too full of things I'd seen." He glanced at her. "My father recognized it before I did, said I needed open country to match the size of what I was carrying." Margaret absorbed this rare personal disclosure. Was he right? "Yes," Will acknowledged simply. "Something about the scale of this land puts human troubles in perspective. Not that they disappear, but they find their proper place." "That's beautifully expressed," Margaret said softly. Will looked momentarily embarrassed. "Not much of a poet, just how it feels." "The best poetry comes from honest feeling, not clever wordplay," she countered. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by birdsong and the gentle murmur of the stream. Margaret found herself studying Will's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight cleft in his chin, the way the breeze ruffled his dark hair. As if sensing her gaze, he turned to meet it. The directness of his blue eyes made her breath catch. "Margaret," he began, then seemed to reconsider his words. "I'm glad the storm brought you here." The simple statement contained layers of meaning that made her heart race. "So am I," she replied softly, "even if it wasn't part of my plans." "Life's best moments rarely are," Will observed, a hint of a smile touching his lips. They lingered longer than strictly necessary, neither eager to end this interlude away from the ranch's bustle. When they finally packed up to leave, Will helped Margaret mount Belle, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than required. The contact, even through layers of clothing, sent warmth spreading through her. Their return journey took them along a different path, a scenic route that offered spectacular views across the property. Will pointed out a distant peak where he sometimes rode to think, a hidden valley where wildflowers bloomed earlier than anywhere else on the ranch, places that held special meaning to him. It felt like he was sharing not just his land but pieces of himself, and Margaret treasured each revelation. As they approached the ranch house, the sense of returning home struck Margaret with unexpected force. In just a few days, this place had come to feel familiar and welcoming in a way that surprised her. The thought of leaving for Coloma created a hollow feeling in her chest that she tried to ignore. They had just reached the barn when Tom rode in rapidly from the direction of town. "Bridge is nearly repaired," he called out as he approached. "Should be passable by tomorrow afternoon. Mayor sent word they're expecting Miss Jenkins day after tomorrow." The news, which should have been welcome, fell between Margaret and Will like a physical barrier. She dismounted without waiting for his assistance, needing a moment to compose her expression. "That's good news," she managed finally, turning to face Will. "I should prepare my things." His face had resumed the careful neutrality she'd seen when they first met, emotions tucked safely away. "Of course. You've been delayed long enough." The distance in his tone hurt more than it should have. Margaret handed Belle's reins to a waiting stable boy and walked toward the house, confusion and disappointment warring within her. Had she misinterpreted everything? The growing connection between them, the moments of shared understanding. Sarah greeted her with typical warmth, but quickly sensed her subdued mood. "What's wrong, dear? Did something happen on the ride? The bridge will be repaired tomorrow," Margaret explained, trying to sound positive. I'll be leaving for Coloma the day after." Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. "I see, and Will didn't take the news well." "He didn't seem to have any particular reaction," Margaret admitted. "Perhaps I've been foolish imagining." Sarah sighed, patting Margaret's hand. "That man. Sometimes I think the war damaged more than just his body. He's built walls so high he doesn't know how to lower them, even when he wants to." "You think he wants to?" Margaret couldn't keep the hope from her voice. "I've known Will Steele for 7 years," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "In all that time, I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching." This revelation gave Margaret pause. Even so, Coloma is only 7 miles away. If he wanted to pursue anything, distance wouldn't be an insurmountable obstacle. "For most men, no," Sarah agreed. "But Will has convinced himself he's meant to be alone, that his duty is to this ranch and nothing else." She squeezed Margaret's hand. "Give him time. Some hearts open slowly, especially when they've been guarding themselves for years." Margaret nodded, grateful for the insight even as her heart ached. "I have a commitment to the school. I can't abandon that." "Of course not," Sarah said firmly. "You must follow your calling, just don't close any doors yet." That evening, dinner was a strained affair. Will was polite but distant, speaking only when necessary and retiring to his study immediately afterward with paperwork that apparently couldn't wait. Margaret tried not to take it personally, reminding herself of Sarah's words, but the withdrawal stung nonetheless. Rather than joining him in the great room as had become her habit, she remained in the kitchen helping Sarah preserve early strawberries from the garden. The familiar domestic task was soothing, giving her hands something to do while her mind processed the day's emotional whiplash. "He'll come around," Sarah said confidently as they sealed the last jar. "Just needs time to sort through his feelings." "Perhaps," Margaret replied, not entirely convinced, "but I'll be gone the day after tomorrow." Sarah's expression turned mischievous. "Then we'd better make sure he has reason to visit Coloma regularly, hadn't we?" The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret washed and packed her recovered belongings, trying not to dwell on her imminent departure. Will was absent most of the day, having ridden out at dawn to check on reports of strays near the property's western boundary. By mid-afternoon, confirmation arrived that the bridge was indeed repaired and the road to Coloma clear. Margaret tried to feel excited about finally reaching her destination, finally beginning the job she'd traveled so far to take. Instead, she felt a persistent melancholy that no amount of rational thought could dispel. She was hanging the last of her dresses in the wardrobe when a knock sounded at her door. Expecting Sarah, she called, "Come in." It was Will who entered, looking somewhat uncomfortable. He carried a wooden crate filled with books. "Thought you might want these for the school," he said, setting the crate on a nearby table. "Basic readers, arithmetic primers, some natural history." Margaret crossed to examine them, genuinely touched by the gesture. "This is incredibly generous. The children will be thrilled." "There's more if you need them," Will offered, his hands finding his pockets in a gesture she'd come to recognize as nervousness. "And I've written to a publisher in Denver about discounted rates for educational materials." "Thank you," Margaret said, unable to keep the emotion from her voice. She looked up at him, trying to read his carefully composed expression. "Will, I also wanted to say," he interrupted, "that I hope you'll feel welcome to visit the ranch whenever you'd like. Sarah would be disappointed not to see you again, and Lewis is already planning to ride into town once he's healed to show off his battle scars to anyone who'll listen." Margaret recognized the deliberate distance in his words, framing any future visits in terms of others, not himself. "And you?" she asked quietly. "Would you be disappointed not to see me again?" The direct question seemed to catch him off guard, For a moment, raw emotion showed in his eyes: longing, fear, uncertainty. "I'm not good at this, Margaret," he said finally, his voice low. "At feelings, expressing them." "You don't have to be good at it," she replied gently. "You just have to be honest." Will ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling. "These past days have been. I've never met anyone like you, but you have your teaching, your plans. I have the ranch. It's not fair to complicate your life when you're just starting this new chapter." Margaret stepped closer, heart pounding. "What if I want complications? What if I think some things are worth pursuing, even if the timing isn't perfect?" His eyes met hers, hope and doubt warring in their blue depths. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I care for you, Will Steele," Margaret said simply. "More than I thought possible in such a short time. And yes, I'm going to Coloma tomorrow to fulfill my commitment to the school. But Coloma is 7 miles away, not 700. Will's expression transformed slowly, hope winning out over doubt. 7 miles isn't so far," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Not for a man with a good horse," Margaret added with a tentative smile. The tension in Will's shoulders eased visibly. "I've been a fool, haven't I, pulling away instead of saying what I feel?" "Perhaps a little," Margaret conceded, her smile widening. "But you can remedy that now." Will took a step toward her, then another, until barely a breath separated them. Slowly, giving her every chance to retreat, he raised a hand to her cheek. "Margaret Jenkins," he said softly, "I've been falling for you since the moment you stood in that gully, soaked to the skin and still worried about your horse. You're the bravest, most compassionate woman I've ever known, and the thought of you leaving tomorrow makes me realize I don't want to go back to a life without you in it." Margaret's heart soared at his words. She leaned into his touch, covering his hand with her own. "Then don't visit me in town. Let me visit here. Let's see where this leads day by day." Will's smile, rare and transformative, brightened his entire face. "I'd like that very much." When he finally kissed her, it was gentle and questioning at first, then deepening as she responded with equal fervor. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as hers wound around his neck. It felt right, inevitable, like coming home after a long journey. They broke apart slowly, both a little breathless. Will rested his forehead against hers, his expression filled with wonder. "I never expected this," he murmured. "When I found you in that storm." "Life's best moments rarely go as planned," Margaret reminded him, echoing his words from their ride. Will laughed softly, the sound warming her to her core. "Wise woman." They might have remained that way longer, but a discreet knock at the still open door interrupted them. Sarah stood in the doorway, looking thoroughly pleased with herself. "Dinner will be ready in 30 minutes, she announced, making no comment about their obvious embrace. "Lewis and the boys are joining us to say farewell to Miss Jenkins." With a knowing smile, she added, "Though I suspect we'll be seeing plenty of her in the future." After she departed, Will and Margaret exchanged amused glances. "Sarah's been dropping hints for days," Will admitted. "Said I'd regret it forever if I let you go to Coloma without speaking my mind." "Smart woman," Margaret replied, smoothing his shirt collar where her hands had rumpled it. "I'm glad you listened." The farewell dinner that evening was a joyous affair, with Lewis proposing increasingly elaborate toasts to Margaret's health and future success as a teacher. The ranch hands presented her with a small carved wooden apple for the teacher, young Jake explained shyly. Will remained close to her throughout the evening, their new understanding creating a warm current between them that everyone seemed to notice but tactfully didn't mention. When Margaret finally retired for the night, he walked her to the foot of the stairs. "I'll drive you to town myself tomorrow," he told her. "There are some supplies I need anyway." "I'd like that," she replied, warmed by the thought of having those additional hours together. Will glanced around to confirm they were momentarily unobserved, then pressed a swift kiss to her lips. "Sleep well, Margaret." "You too," she whispered. Reluctantly ascending the stairs in her room, Margaret found herself too full of emotions to sleep immediately. She sat by the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape of the running S, marveling at how thoroughly her life had changed in less than a week. What had begun as a terrifying ordeal had transformed into something unexpected and precious. The morning brought a flurry of activity as Margaret's belongings were loaded into Will's wagon. Sarah provided a basket of food for your first few days in the cottage, though there was clearly enough to feed Margaret for a week. Louis insisted on coming outside despite his injured arm to bid her farewell, extracting a promise that she would visit once he was fully healed, to see how well Senor Will's doctoring worked. The drive to Coloma took just over an hour along the freshly repaired road. Will pointed out landmarks along the way, including the spot where he'd found her during the storm, now a peaceful meadow showing no trace of the drama that had unfolded there. "Hard to believe it was only 5 days ago," Margaret commented, shading her eyes to look across the landscape. "It feels like much longer. In some ways," Will agreed. "In others, it seems like yesterday I was carrying you into the house, half frozen and still arguing about needing to reach town." Margaret laughed at the memory. "I must have seemed terribly stubborn." "Determined," Will corrected with a smile. "It was admirable, if ill-advised given the circumstances." Coloma appeared on the horizon, a small but tidy settlement nestled in a valley with mountains rising beyond. As they approached, Margaret took in the wooden buildings lining the main street, the church steeple rising above the other structures, and the newer building that must be the schoolhouse on a slight rise at the town's edge. People nodded and waved as Will guided the wagon down the main street, clearly recognizing him. He returned the greetings with the easy confidence of a man respected in the community. "Everybody knows everybody here," he explained. "One of the benefits or drawbacks, depending on your perspective of small-town life." "I like it," Margaret decided, observing the interactions with interest. "In St. Louis, I could walk for blocks without seeing a familiar face." They stopped first at the mayor's office, where a jovial man named Harrison welcomed Margaret effusively. "We'd nearly given you up for lost in that storm," he exclaimed, pumping her hand enthusiastically. "Lucky Will found you when he did." "Very lucky," Margaret agreed, exchanging a private glance with Will. After completing the necessary paperwork and receiving keys to the teacher's cottage, they visited the schoolhouse. It was a simple but well-built structure with large windows to admit plenty of light. The single room contained rows of desks, a larger desk at the front for the teacher, and bookshelves along one wall currently sparsely populated. "We'll remedy that," Will murmured, noting the direction of her gaze. "Those books I brought will be just the beginning." Margaret walked the length of the room, imagining it filled with children, visualizing how she would arrange things to create the best learning environment. Despite her mixed emotions about leaving the ranch, excitement about her new position began to build. "It's perfect," she decided, turning to Will with a bright smile. "I can't wait to begin." His answering smile held pride and something deeper. "You'll be wonderful." The teacher's cottage proved to be a charming small house just behind the school, 2 rooms downstairs, and a sleeping loft above, with a small garden plot that would be perfect for Abigail Wilson's seeds. Previous occupants had left it clean and in good repair, with basic furnishings including a bed, table, chairs, and cookstove. Will carried in Margaret's trunks and the crate of books, setting them carefully in the main room. They worked together to unpack Sarah's food basket, arranging items on shelves and in the small pantry. The domestic activity felt natural, comfortable, as if they'd done it together many times before. When everything was arranged to Margaret's satisfaction, Will reluctantly checked his pocket watch. "I should head back before dark," he said, though his expression made it clear he'd rather stay. Margaret nodded, suddenly nervous about being left alone in her new home. "Thank you for everything, Will. For saving me from the storm, for opening your home to me, for falling in love with you," he finished softly, stepping closer to take her hands in his. That part required no effort at all. The words the first time either had spoken of love directly made Margaret's heart soar. "I love you too," she whispered. Will's kiss was tender at first, then deepening with promise. When they finally parted, both were breathing faster and his eyes had darkened with emotion. "I'll be back in 3 days," he promised, reluctantly releasing her. "Sooner if you need anything at all. Just send word to the general store. Roy Baldwin can get a message to the ranch quickly." 3 days, Margaret repeated, already counting the hours in her mind. At the door, Will turned back one last time. "The storm may have left you stranded, Margaret Jenkins, but I think it led you exactly where you were meant to be." Margaret smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "I think you may be right." After he left, Margaret stood in the doorway watching until his wagon disappeared from view. Then she turned back to her new home, heart full of anticipation for what the future would bring, both in her classroom and with the steadfast rancher who had rescued her in more ways than one. True to his word, Will returned to Coloma 3 days later, arriving just as Margaret was dismissing her first informal gathering of students. He waited patiently outside as she answered parents' questions and bid farewell to the children, his presence a steadying force even from a distance. When the last family departed, he approached with a bundle of wildflowers in hand. "For the teacher," he said with a smile that made her heart skip. "How was your first day?" "Wonderful," Margaret replied honestly, accepting the flowers with a touched smile. "The children are eager to learn, and the parents seem supportive." They fell into a pattern over the subsequent weeks. Will would visit Coloma twice weekly, sometimes bringing supplies or books for the school, always making time to help Margaret with projects around her cottage or simply to walk with her through town. On Sundays, after church, he would often drive her back to the Running S for dinner, returning her to town before nightfall. The residents of Coloma quickly drew their own conclusions about the relationship between their new teacher and the respected rancher. If any disapproved, they kept such thoughts to themselves, perhaps influenced by the obvious happiness of the couple and the improvements Will had begun funding for the school. True to his promise, books began arriving regularly, not just for the school but for the town library that was rapidly taking shape in a small building adjacent to the general store. Margaret found herself recruited to help organize the collection, a task she undertook with enthusiasm. As spring yielded to summer, Margaret's cottage garden bloomed with Abigail Wilson's sweet peas and morning glories, their bright colors framing the doorway. Inside, the once sparse rooms had taken on a cozy character with handmade curtains from Sarah, a rocking chair Will had crafted during evenings at the ranch, and shelves lined with Margaret's beloved books. The school thrived under her guidance. Children who had previously shown little interest in learning began bringing their assignments completed and asking for more. Parents commented on the positive changes they observed at home: more reading, more questions, more curiosity about the wider world. One warm evening in late July, Will arrived unexpectedly on a Wednesday, not one of his usual visiting days. Margaret looked up from watering her garden to find him dismounting from midnight, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. "Will, this is a pleasant surprise," she greeted him, setting aside her watering can. "Hope I'm not intruding," he replied, removing his hat. "I needed to speak with you about something important." A flutter of anxiety passed through Margaret. "Of course. Would you like to come inside?" "I was just about to make tea." Will shook his head. "Actually, I thought we might take a ride. There's something I'd like to show you." Intrigued, Margaret agreed. Within minutes, she had changed into her riding skirt and was mounted on Belle, following Will out of town toward the west, not in the direction of the running S. "Where are we going?" she asked after they'd ridden for about 20 minutes. "You'll see," Will replied mysteriously, a hint of a smile playing around his lips. Another 10 minutes brought them to a rise overlooking a small valley. A clear stream wound through lush grass, cottonwoods offering shade along its banks. Wildflowers dotted the meadow in splashes of color, and in the distance, mountains rose against the blue sky. Will drew midnight to a halt, and Margaret followed suit. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "I didn't know this valley was here." "It's part of the running S," Will explained, dismounting and helping her down from Belle. "The newest section. I purchased it last month from Jeremiah Wilson, who's decided to retire to Denver to be near his grandchildren." He took her hand, leading her to a particularly picturesque spot near the stream. "I thought. That is, I hoped." For once, his usual composure seemed to desert him. "Margaret, these past months have been the happiest of my life." Her heart began to race as she realized what might be happening. "Mine too," she said softly. Will took both her hands in his blue eyes serious and full of emotion. "I never expected to find someone who would make me want to build a life beyond the ranch. Someone who would make me look to the future with hope instead of just duty." He drew a deep breath. "I love you, Margaret Jenkins, with all that I am, and I'd be honored if you would consider becoming my wife." Joy bubbled up within her, so intense it almost hurt. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, Will, I love you, and nothing would make me happier." His face transformed with relief and happiness. From his pocket, he produced a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the afternoon light. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "My father gave it to me before he died, said to save it for when I found a woman worthy of it." "It's beautiful," Margaret whispered, blinking back tears of joy. "I'll treasure it always." Will's kiss was tender and full of promise, a pledge of the life they would build together. When they finally parted, he gestured to the valley around them. "I thought we might build our home here," he said. "Close enough to town for your teaching, but part of the ranch too, a place that belongs to both of us." Margaret looked around, envisioning it immediately, a comfortable house overlooking the stream, perhaps a garden larger than her cottage plot, room for children to run and play. "It's perfect," she declared. "Absolutely perfect." They spent an hour walking the property, Will pointing out where he thought the house might stand, Margaret suggesting additions and modifications. It was the first of many such conversations as their shared vision took shape. That evening, they rode to the ranch to share their news. Sarah's joyful tears and Lewis's exuberant congratulations set the tone for the celebration that followed, with ranch hands offering good-natured toasts and predictions about how many children the couple might have. Word spread quickly through Coloma. The school board, after expressing initial concern about losing their teacher, were reassured by Margaret's commitment to continue teaching at least until a suitable replacement could be found, and possibly longer, depending on how she managed the demands of marriage and potential motherhood. The wedding took place in October, when the aspen trees had turned gold against the evergreens, and the first crisp hint of autumn filled the air. The ceremony was held at the Running S, with Reverend Phillips from Coloma officiating. It seemed the entire town turned out, along with ranchers and their families from miles around. Margaret wore a gown of ivory silk that Sarah and Abigail Wilson had secretly worked on for weeks. Will, unusually formal in a new black suit, waited for her beneath an arch of autumn branches and late-blooming wildflowers, his expression a mixture of awe and adoration, as she walked toward him on Jeremiah Wilson's arm. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to love, honor, and cherish through whatever life might bring. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Will's kiss was both tender and possessive, drawing good-natured cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration continued well into the evening, with tables set up in the yard, lanterns hanging from tree branches, and a fiddler from town providing music for dancing. Margaret found herself passed from partner to partner as various men claimed the traditional dance with the bride, but her eyes continually sought Will across the gathering. Later, as twilight deepened into night and the party showed no signs of abating, Will found her near the edge of the celebration. Without a word, he took her hand and led her away from the noise and light, toward a quieter spot near the garden. "Happy?" he asked softly, drawing her into his arms. "Completely," she assured him, resting her head against his chest. "Though I wouldn't object to stealing away from our own wedding soon." Will's chuckle rumbled beneath her ear. "I was hoping you'd say that." They made their goodbyes shortly after, riding together in Will's wagon not to the ranch house, but to the valley where their new home was under construction. Though not yet complete, the main bedroom and living areas were finished, a wedding gift from the ranch hands who had worked tirelessly to ensure the newlyweds would have a place of their own from the first night. Lanterns had been lit inside, casting a warm glow through the windows. As they approached, Will drew the wagon to a halt. "Welcome home, Mrs. Steele," he said softly, before lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Their life together unfolded with the changing seasons. Margaret continued teaching through that first winter, making the short ride to town each morning and returning home each afternoon to the warmth of their new house. Will divided his time between managing the ranch and working on improvements to their home, adding bookshelves, a study for Margaret, and eventually, a nursery. Their first child, a son they named James after Margaret's father, arrived the following autumn, a strong, healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determination. Margaret took a temporary leave from teaching, finding new fulfillment in motherhood while still helping with the school's library and occasional special lessons. The town grew steadily, as did the running S. Will's progressive approaches to ranching and land management brought recognition beyond the county, while the library he had established became a model for other small communities. Margaret's educational initiatives expanded to include adult literacy classes and a women's reading circle that met monthly in their home. 2 years after James, they welcomed a daughter, Emma Sarah, named for Will's sister and the woman who had become like a mother to them both. Sarah, though officially retired, spent much of her time with the children, regaling them with stories of the early days at the ranch and teaching them the same practical skills she had once taught their father. On the 5th anniversary of the day Will had found Margaret in the storm, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching James and Emma playing in the yard with the puppies from Ranger's latest litter. The house had expanded along with their family additional bedrooms, a larger kitchen, more bookshelves always needed for their growing collection. "You ever think about how differently our lives might have gone if that storm hadn't happened?" Margaret asked, leaning against Will's side as his arm encircled her waist. "Sometimes," he admitted. "You'd have reached Coloma safely, started teaching. I'd have continued on at the ranch. Would we have met eventually, at church perhaps, or a town gathering?" Will considered this, his thumb tracing idle patterns on her waist. "Probably. Coloma's not that big, but I might not have had the courage to pursue you properly." He smiled down at her. "Took extraordinary circumstances to make me admit what I wanted." Margaret reached up to touch his face, still handsome and dearer to her with each passing year. "Then I'm grateful for that storm, frightening as it was at the time." "As am I," Will murmured, bending to kiss her with the same tenderness that still made her heart race. "For bringing you to me, and for every day since." As the children's laughter echoed across their land and the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Margaret Steele counted her blessings: a loving husband, beautiful children, meaningful work, and a community that had become truly home. The storm that had once threatened her life had instead led her to everything she'd never known she wanted. Will's arms tightened around her as if reading her thoughts. "I love you," he said simply, the words no less powerful for their frequent repetition. "And I love you," Margaret replied, knowing with absolute certainty that some journeys, no matter how difficult their beginnings, led precisely where one was meant to be all along.